Welcome to the Nocturnal Chronicler. Tonight, we journey back through the mists of time to feudal Japan, where the clash of steel and the pursuit of perfection forged legends that echo through the centuries. This is the story of Miyamoto Musashi, the sword saint, the undefeated warrior, and one of history's most profound philosophers of combat and life itself. Settle in, dear listener, and let me transport you to an era of samurai, honor, and the relentless pursuit of mastery. In the year 1584, in a small village nestled among the mountains of Harima province, a child was born who would one day become the most feared swordsman Japan had ever known. The village was called Miyamoto, a humble collection of wooden houses surrounded by forests and rice paddies, where farmers toiled under the watchful gaze of distant lords. The child was named Benosuke, though the world would come to know him by another name entirely. His father was Shinmen Munisai, a man of considerable martial skill who had earned recognition as an expert in the art of the jite, a weapon used to disarm sword-wielding opponents. Munisai was a harsh man, demanding and often cruel, and his relationship with his young son would be marked by conflict and violence from the very beginning. Some accounts suggest that Munisai was so severe in his discipline that he once threw a dagger at the boy during a dispute. Young Benosuke's mother died when he was still a child, and his father soon remarried and started a new family, leaving the boy to be raised by relatives. This abandonment would shape the young warrior's character in profound ways. He learned early that he could rely on no one but himself, that the world was a harsh and unforgiving place, and that only the strong would survive its challenges. The boy grew wild and fierce, spending his days roaming the forests and mountains around his village. He was tall for his age, with a powerful build that hinted at the formidable warrior he would become. His face was marked by a skin condition that left him with a rough, pockmarked appearance, and his hair was often unkempt and matted. He cared nothing for his appearance, focused entirely on developing his strength and fighting ability. By the age of 7, Benosuke had begun teaching himself the ways of the sword. He would fashion wooden blades from branches and practice his strikes against trees until his hands bled. He studied the movements of animals, particularly the way they fought and hunted, incorporating their instincts into his developing style. He was utterly consumed by the martial arts, seeing them not merely as skills to be learned, but as a path to something greater. His uncle, a priest named Dorimbo, tried to instill some discipline and education in the wild boy. He taught him to read and write, introduced him to Buddhist philosophy, and attempted to channel his aggressive nature into more constructive pursuits. But Benosuke was resistant to formal education. He wanted only to fight, to test himself against others, to prove his worth through combat. When Benosuke was 13 years old, he encountered a notice posted in the nearby town. A wandering martial artist named Arima Kihei had arrived in the region and was issuing a challenge to any warrior who wished to face him in single combat. Kihei was an adult swordsman of considerable reputation, trained in the Shinto-ryu school of swordsmanship. He was seeking worthy opponents to test his skills against. Without hesitation, the young Benosuke wrote his name on the challenge board, accepting the duel. When Kihei's attendants saw that their master's challenger was merely a boy, they were shocked and amused. They tried to dissuade the young fool from his reckless course, warning him that Kihei would surely kill him. But Benosuke was unmoved by their warnings. He had made his decision, and he would not back down. The morning of the duel arrived, and Benosuke walked to the designated meeting place carrying only a wooden staff he had cut from the forest. Arima Kihei appeared in full battle dress, his razor-sharp steel blade gleaming in the morning light. He looked at his young opponent with a mixture of contempt and disbelief. This was to be his challenger, this wild-looking boy with a wooden stick. Kihei drew his sword and advanced, perhaps intending to simply frighten the boy into submission. But Benosuke showed no fear. As Kihei raised his blade to strike, the boy exploded into motion. He rushed forward with terrifying speed, closing the distance before his opponent could react. His wooden staff crashed into Kihei's skull with devastating force, and the experienced swordsman crumpled to the ground. But Benosuke did not stop there. In a display of ferocity that shocked all who witnessed it, he continued to beat the fallen warrior until Kihei lay dead in the dirt. It was a brutal, savage victory, utterly without the refinement or honor that the samurai code demanded. But it was effective. At 13 years old, Benosuke had killed his first man in single combat. This victory transformed the young warrior. He had proven to himself that his skills were real, that he could defeat even experienced swordsmen through pure aggression and fighting instinct. But he also recognized that he had much to learn. His technique was raw and undeveloped, relying more on brute force than skill. If he wished to become truly great, he would need to study, to practice, and to test himself against ever more formidable opponents. And so began the period known as Mushashugyo, the warrior's pilgrimage. Benosuke left his village and set out across Japan, seeking duels with any warrior who would face him. He lived as a vagabond, sleeping in forests and fields, eating whatever he could find or hunt. He abandoned all concern for comfort or appearance, focusing solely on his martial development. During these wandering years, he adopted a new name, Miyamoto Musashi. The surname came from his birthplace, while Musashi was taken from the ancient name of a province, perhaps to invoke a sense of vast, unconquered territory. It was a name that would become synonymous with martial excellence, spoken with reverence by warriors for generations to come. Musashi's appearance during this time was striking and unusual. He rarely bathed, and his long hair hung in tangled locks around his scarred face. He wore rough peasant clothing rather than the refined dress of a samurai. He carried two swords, one long and one short, which was not unusual in itself, but his manner of wearing them was deliberately unconventional. He wanted to project an image of wild, unpredictable danger. In 1597, when Musashi was roughly 13 or 14, a conflict erupted that would reshape Japan's political landscape. The great warlord Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who had unified much of the country, launched an invasion of Korea. Warriors from across Japan flocked to join this campaign, seeking glory and advancement. Whether Musashi participated in this conflict is unclear, but the chaos of war certainly shaped the world in which he was coming of age. Then came the year 1600, and with it, the most decisive battle in Japanese history. The forces of Tokugawa Ieyasu faced those loyal to Toyotomi's young heir at a place called Sekigahara. The outcome would determine who would rule Japan for centuries to come. Musashi, now 16 years old, found himself caught up in this monumental conflict. He fought on the side of the Western Army, the forces opposing Tokugawa. It was the losing side. The battle was a catastrophe for those who had opposed Ieyasu, and thousands of warriors were slaughtered on that bloody field. Musashi survived, though exactly how he escaped the defeat is not recorded. Some accounts suggest he was among the Ashigaru, the common foot soldiers, rather than the elite samurai warriors. The defeat at Sekigahara was a profound experience for the young warrior. He had seen the chaos and horror of large-scale warfare, the way that grand strategies and individual skill could both be overwhelmed by the tides of battle. He had faced death and survived, but he had also been on the losing side of history. This experience would shape his philosophy in important ways, teaching him that survival itself was a form of victory. After Sekigahara, Musashi resumed his wandering and his quest for martial perfection. He traveled throughout Japan, challenging sword schools and individual warriors wherever he found them. His reputation began to grow as he accumulated victory after victory. He was developing not just his technique, but his philosophy, beginning to understand that swordsmanship was about far more than simply learning to swing a blade. It was during this period that Musashi began to develop his distinctive two-sword style, which he would later call Niten Ichiryu, the school of two heavens as one. Most swordsmen of the era used only the long sword, the katana, in combat. The short sword, the wakizashi, was primarily a backup weapon or used for close-quarters fighting. But Musashi saw potential in wielding both blades simultaneously. The development of this style required years of experimentation and practice. Fighting with two swords meant sacrificing the two-handed power grip that most swordsmen relied upon. Each blade had to be wielded with one hand, which demanded tremendous strength and coordination. Musashi spent countless hours training his left hand to match the skill of his right, developing ambidextrous mastery that few warriors could match. He also began to formulate his theories about combat and strategy. He observed that most swordsmen were rigid in their thinking, bound by the traditions and techniques of their schools. They would respond to situations according to their training, following predictable patterns that a clever opponent could exploit. Musashi sought to transcend these limitations to develop a style that was fluid and adaptable, capable of responding to any situation. Around the year 1604, Musashi arrived in the city of Kyoto, the cultural heart of Japan and home to some of the most prestigious sword schools in the land. Here he would face his greatest challenge yet, the Yoshioka school. The Yoshioka clan had served as sword instructors to the Ashikaga shoguns for generations. They were among the most respected martial artists in Japan, and their school attracted students from across the country. Musashi issued a challenge to Yoshioka Seijuro, the head of the school. Seijuro was a proud and accomplished swordsman, confident in his abilities and the superiority of his family's techniques. He accepted the challenge, perhaps expecting an easy victory over this rough, uncouth wanderer who dared to challenge Yoshioka's supremacy. The duel was set to take place outside the city at a field near the Rendai Temple. Musashi arrived hours before the appointed time, concealing himself to observe the terrain and any potential ambush. When dawn came and Seijuro appeared with his entourage, Musashi waited. He let the sun rise higher, let his opponent grow frustrated and angry at his apparent absence. Finally, when Seijuro's patience was nearly exhausted, Musashi emerged. The Yoshioka master charged at him, eager to punish this disrespectful vagabond. But Musashi was ready. With a single devastating blow, he struck Seijuro down, breaking his arm so severely that the master would never fight again. The duel lasted only moments. The reputation of the Yoshioka school had suffered a terrible blow, but this was only the beginning. Seijuro's younger brother, Yoshioka Denshichiro, was determined to avenge the family honor. He challenged Musashi to a second duel, which the wanderer readily accepted. This time, Denshichiro came armed with a staff reinforced with steel rings, hoping that this unusual weapon would give him an advantage against Musashi's swords. Once again, Musashi employed psychological warfare. He arrived late, allowing his opponent's tension and anger to build. When he finally appeared, Denshichiro attacked with fury, swinging his heavy staff in powerful arcs. But Musashi remained calm, reading his opponent's movements, waiting for the perfect moment. When that moment came, he struck with lethal precision. Denshichiro fell dead, and the Yoshioka school's shame was compounded. The remaining members of the Yoshioka clan were now desperate. They had lost their two greatest warriors to this single wanderer, and their reputation was in ruins. They made a decision that would abandon all pretense of honorable combat. They would ambush Musashi with overwhelming numbers and cut him down like a dog. They sent word that Yoshioka Matashichiro, the young son of Seijuro, would face Musashi in a final duel at a place called Ichijoji, near a great pine tree. Musashi suspected treachery. This time he arrived not hours but a full day early, hiding himself in the area and observing the preparations. He watched as dozens of Yoshioka retainers and students arrived, armed with swords, bows, and arquebuses. They positioned themselves around the meeting place, clearly planning to slaughter him the moment he appeared. As the appointed hour approached, Musashi made his move. But instead of approaching from the expected direction, where the ambushers were concentrated, he circled around and attacked from an unexpected angle. He burst from concealment at a dead run, heading straight for the young Matashichiro before the boy's protectors could react. In the chaos that followed, Musashi cut down Matashichiro with a single stroke and then fought his way through the stunned Yoshioka forces. Accounts differ on exactly how many men he killed that night, but all agree that he carved a bloody path through his enemies. Arrows flew past him, blades sought his flesh, but Musashi moved with supernatural speed and ferocity. By the time he escaped into the darkness, the Yoshioka school was effectively destroyed. This battle at Ichijoji represented a turning point in Musashi's development. He had faced not just individual opponents, but an entire army, and he had prevailed through cunning, preparation, and absolute commitment to victory. He had learned that the warrior who relies solely on technique is vulnerable to overwhelming force, but the warrior who combines technique with strategy and psychological insight can overcome any odds. The aftermath of the Yoshioka vendetta brought Musashi both fame and notoriety. Some admired his incredible martial prowess and his willingness to face any challenge. Others criticized his methods as dishonorable, pointing to his habit of arriving late to duels and his brutal, efficient fighting style that lacked the elegance expected of a true samurai. But no one could deny his effectiveness. He had annihilated one of Japan's most prestigious sword schools almost single-handedly. Musashi continued his wandering, but he was no longer an unknown vagabond. His reputation preceded him wherever he went. Some warriors actively sought him out, hoping to test themselves against the man who had destroyed the Yoshioka. Others fled at the mere mention of his name, unwilling to risk their lives against such a terrifying opponent. Musashi welcomed all challengers, still hungry for the experience that only real combat could provide. During this period, Musashi began to fight with weapons other than swords. He used wooden staffs, wooden swords, and whatever implements came to hand. This was partly practical, as he faced so many duels that using real blades for each would have meant constantly killing his opponents. But it was also a statement of his philosophy. He was demonstrating that true martial skill transcended any particular weapon, that a master could defeat armed opponents with a simple piece of wood. He also began to refine his understanding of what he called the void, a concept that would become central to his later philosophy. The void was not emptiness in the negative sense, but rather a state of perfect readiness, free from the distractions of fear, anger, or predetermined technique. When a warrior achieved this state, he could respond to any situation with perfect appropriateness, neither thinking nor hesitating, simply acting in harmony with the moment. These years of constant combat and philosophical development were transforming Musashi from a skilled fighter into something more, a true master of the martial way. He was beginning to understand that the way of the sword was not separate from the way of life itself. The principles that led to victory in combat, awareness, adaptability, decisiveness, and inner calm, were the same principles that led to success in any endeavor. By the time he reached his mid-20s, Musashi had fought in over 60 duels and had never been defeated. This record was unprecedented in an era filled with skilled swordsmen and deadly encounters. But Musashi was not satisfied. He sensed that there was still something more to discover, some deeper truth that lay beyond mere technical mastery and battle experience. His fighting style continued to evolve. He had moved beyond the raw aggression of his youth, developing a more subtle and efficient approach. He learned to read his opponents before they moved, to understand their intentions through the tiniest shifts in posture or expression. He cultivated what he called the observing eye, the ability to see everything while focusing on nothing specific, to perceive the whole of a situation at once. He also developed his understanding of timing, which he considered one of the most crucial elements of combat. Timing was not simply about moving fast or slow, but about matching one's actions to the rhythm of the encounter. Sometimes victory came from moving before the opponent expected. Sometimes it came from patience, from waiting for the perfect moment while the opponent exhausted himself with futile attacks. Musashi's psychological tactics became increasingly sophisticated. He understood that most duels were decided before the first blade was drawn, that the warrior who entered combat with doubt or fear in his heart had already lost. His unconventional appearance, his habit of arriving late, his unorthodox techniques, all of these served to unsettle his opponents, to make them question their training and their chances of survival. The years passed, and Musashi's fame continued to grow. Stories of his exploits spread across Japan, many of them embellished by retelling until the man became almost mythical. He was said to have killed enemies with his bare hands, to have defeated entire groups of attackers single-handedly, to have never been touched by an opponent's blade. While some of these stories were exaggerations, they reflected a genuine truth. Miyamoto Musashi was the most formidable warrior of his generation. Yet for all his success, Musashi remained restless. He had achieved a level of martial excellence that few could imagine, yet he sensed that there was still more to learn. The way of the sword was a path without end, and he was determined to follow it wherever it led. Little did he know that his greatest duel and his most profound transformation still lay ahead of him. As he approached his 30th year, Musashi heard rumors of another swordsman whose fame rivaled his own. This man was called Sasaki Kojiro, and he was said to wield a blade of extraordinary length with unmatched skill. The inevitable confrontation between these two legendary warriors would become the most famous duel in Japanese history, and it would mark the beginning of a new chapter in Musashi's extraordinary life. But that story, dear listener, belongs to another night. For now we leave our sword saint at the height of his fame, a warrior without equal, still searching for the ultimate truth that lies at the heart of the martial way. His journey of blood and enlightenment was far from over, and the lessons he would learn in the years to come would transform him from a mere fighter into one of history's greatest philosophers of strategy and life itself. But before we part ways tonight, let us delve deeper into the world that shaped this remarkable warrior. For to understand Musashi is to understand the turbulent age in which he lived. The Japan of Musashi's youth was a land emerging from more than a century of almost constant warfare. The Sengoku period, the age of warring states, had torn the country apart as rival warlords battled for supremacy. Villages were burned, families scattered, and the old certainties of life were shattered by the endless cycle of conflict. It was an age of opportunity for those bold enough to seize it, but also an age of terrible danger. Musashi was born just as this chaos was beginning to subside. The great unifiers, Oda Nobunaga and Toyotomi Hideyoshi, had brought much of Japan under their control through a combination of military genius and ruthless determination. But the peace they imposed was fragile, built on alliances that could shift at any moment. Everyone knew that when Hideyoshi died, the struggle for power would begin anew. This was the world that shaped young Benosuke's understanding of life. Security was an illusion. Power came from strength, cunning, and the willingness to act decisively when opportunity arose. The weak perished, and the strong survived. These were harsh lessons for a child to learn, but they would serve him well in the brutal path he had chosen. The samurai class itself was in transition during this period. The traditional image of the samurai as a mounted warrior, a noble knight bound by codes of honor, was giving way to a new reality. Warfare had become a matter of massed infantry armed with long spears and, increasingly, firearms imported from the West. The individual warrior's skill mattered less on the battlefield than discipline, logistics, and the ability to coordinate thousands of men. This left many masterless samurai, the ronin, wandering the land in search of employment or purpose. Some became bandits, preying on travelers and villages. Others offered their services as bodyguards or instructors. Still others, like Musashi, devoted themselves to perfecting their martial skills, seeking meaning through the pursuit of excellence. The way of the sword became not just a practical skill but a spiritual path, a means of self-cultivation in a world that had lost its certainties. Musashi's early training, such as it was, drew from this chaotic environment. He had no single master who guided his development in the traditional manner. Instead, he learned through observation, experimentation, and the brutal feedback of actual combat. He studied the techniques of various schools when he could, but he was always willing to discard what did not work and incorporate what did, regardless of its source. This practical, results-oriented approach set Musashi apart from many of his contemporaries. Most swordsmen of the era were deeply invested in the traditions of their schools, following techniques passed down through generations without question. They believed that the founders of their styles had discovered perfect methods and that the student's job was to replicate these methods as faithfully as possible. Innovation was viewed with suspicion, even hostility. Musashi rejected this rigid thinking. He saw that many of these traditional techniques were designed for an earlier era, when combat followed certain rules and expectations. The chaos of the Sengoku period had shattered these conventions. A warrior might face opponents using any weapon or fighting style, under any conditions. Survival demanded adaptability, not adherence to ancient forms. This is not to say that Musashi disrespected tradition entirely. He studied the classical texts of swordsmanship and strategy, absorbing their wisdom even as he questioned their assumptions. He recognized that the masters of the past had valuable insights to offer, but he also understood that their knowledge was incomplete. Each generation had to discover the way anew, building on what came before while transcending its limitations. The physical training of a swordsman in this era was extraordinarily demanding. Musashi would practice his cuts and strikes thousands of times each day, building the muscle memory and endurance necessary for combat. He trained with heavy wooden swords to develop strength, then switched to lighter weapons to cultivate speed and precision. He practiced in all weather conditions, in all terrains, preparing himself for the unpredictable circumstances of real fighting. But physical training alone was not enough. Musashi also cultivated his mental and spiritual capacities with equal dedication. He practiced meditation, learning to quiet the chatter of his mind and achieve states of profound calm and clarity. He studied strategy and tactics, analyzing famous battles and trying to understand why some commanders succeeded while others failed. He observed nature, finding lessons in the movements of water, the growth of plants, and the behavior of animals. This holistic approach to development was unusual for a warrior of his time, and it gave Musashi advantages that his opponents often failed to understand. They might match his physical skills, but they could not match his psychological resilience or strategic insight. When the pressure of combat pushed them toward panic or rigidity, Musashi remained fluid and aware, able to exploit the openings that their fear created. The concept of zanshin, continuing awareness, was central to Musashi's practice. This referred to the state of alertness that a warrior maintained even after delivering a decisive blow. Many fighters relaxed the moment they believed they had won, leaving themselves vulnerable to counterattack. Musashi trained himself to maintain perfect readiness at all times, never assuming that any victory was complete until he was absolutely certain. His development of the two-sword style was a natural extension of these principles. By wielding both the long and short swords simultaneously, Musashi created more options for attack and defense. He could strike with one blade while blocking with the other, or launch coordinated attacks from multiple angles. The style was extremely difficult to master, requiring ambidextrous coordination that most people never developed, but Musashi's relentless practice eventually made it second nature. The psychological dimension of the two-sword style was equally important. Most swordsmen had trained extensively against single-sword opponents and had developed reflexive responses to common attacks. When faced with two blades moving independently, these trained responses often failed. The opponent's mind, searching for familiar patterns, found only confusion. This moment of uncertainty was often all Musashi needed to deliver the decisive blow. Let us return now to the period following his defeat of Arima Kihei, when the young Musashi first began his warrior's pilgrimage. The roads of Japan in this era were dangerous places, haunted by bandits, wild animals, and desperate men with nothing to lose. A lone traveler, especially one who appeared poor and unprotected, was an inviting target. Musashi welcomed these dangers. Each encounter with violence was an opportunity to test and refine his skills. He learned to read the intentions of strangers from a distance, to identify the subtle signs that distinguished an honest traveler from a potential attacker. He developed an uncanny ability to sense danger before it manifested, a sixth sense born of constant vigilance and hard experience. His appearance during this time served as both protection and provocation. Dressed in rough clothing, with his unkempt hair and scarred face, he looked like no one worth robbing, but those who knew of his reputation recognized that this wild appearance concealed lethal skills. To challenge this strange wanderer was to risk everything. The duels of this period varied enormously in character. Some were formal affairs, arranged in advance with witnesses and agreed upon rules. Others were sudden, violent encounters with no warning and no mercy. Musashi learned to handle both types, adapting his approach to the circumstances while never compromising his core principles. In formal duels, Musashi typically employed psychological tactics to gain advantage before the fighting began. His habit of arriving late was calculated to unsettle his opponents, to make them wait in growing tension while their minds conjured images of what was to come. By the time he finally appeared, many were already half defeated, their concentration shattered, and their confidence eroded. The choice of weapons was another element of these psychological games. Musashi would sometimes appear with wooden swords rather than steel blades, a seeming insult to his opponent that was actually a calculated strategy. The wooden sword had its own advantages. It would not kill instantly, allowing Musashi to gauge his opponent's reactions and adjust his approach. And if he won with wood against steel, the victory was all the more impressive. His fighting style during this period was evolving rapidly. The raw aggression of his youth was being tempered by experience and reflection. He was learning when to attack and when to wait, when to press forward and when to create distance. He was developing what he would later call the rhythm of combat, the ability to sense and control the tempo of a fight. The concept of rhythm was crucial to Musashi's mature understanding of combat. Every fight had its own tempo, its own pattern of action and reaction. Most fighters fell into predictable rhythms, attacking and defending in regular cycles that a skilled opponent could exploit. Musashi learned to disrupt these rhythms, to change speed unexpectedly, to create confusion in his opponent's timing. He also studied the relationship between distance and timing. At different distances, different techniques became possible or impossible. A skilled swordsman had to understand these relationships instinctively, knowing exactly when he was within striking range and when he was not. Musashi practiced constantly with partners of different heights and reaches, learning to judge distance with microscopic precision. The years between his first duel and the Yoshioka confrontation were years of intensive learning. Musashi fought dozens of opponents, each one teaching him something new. He faced swordsmen of various schools, each with distinctive techniques and philosophies. He encountered spearmen, staff fighters, chain weapon specialists, and practitioners of armed and unarmed combat. Each encounter added to his understanding. But Musashi was not merely collecting techniques. He was searching for underlying principles that transcended any particular weapon or style. He wanted to understand combat itself, not just one narrow approach to it. This quest for fundamental truth drove him to study beyond the martial arts, examining philosophy, strategy, and the natural world for insights that could be applied to fighting. The influence of Zen Buddhism on Musashi's development was significant, though his relationship with formal religion was complicated. He never became a monk or devoted himself to any particular sect, but he absorbed many Zen concepts, particularly the emphasis on direct experience over intellectual understanding, and the cultivation of a mind that was alert yet calm, focused yet open. The Zen concept of mushin, no mind, was especially important to his martial philosophy. This did not mean thoughtlessness or stupidity, but rather a state of action without deliberation, where the warrior's responses arose spontaneously from his training without the interference of conscious thought. Achieving this state in the heat of combat was the mark of true mastery. Musashi's arrival in Kyoto and his confrontation with the Yoshioka school represented a new phase in his development. Until now, he had fought individual opponents or small groups. The Yoshioka challenge pitted him against an entire institution, a school with decades of tradition and dozens of trained warriors. It was a test not just of his fighting ability but of his strategic thinking. The Yoshioka school traced its lineage back to the famous swordsman Yoshioka Kenpo, who had served the Ashikaga shoguns as an instructor in the art of the sword. The school's techniques emphasized precision and elegance, reflecting its aristocratic heritage. Its students were typically from noble families, trained from childhood in the refined methods of their tradition. Yoshioka Seijuro, the head of the school at the time of Musashi's challenge, was a proud man who embodied these aristocratic values. He viewed Musashi as a crude outsider, a homeless wanderer who had no right to challenge the dignity of the Yoshioka name. He expected to dispatch this upstart quickly and restore the natural order of things. This underestimation was Seijuro's first and greatest mistake. He saw only Musashi's rough exterior and assumed that his skills must be equally unrefined. He did not understand that this wanderer had spent years in constant combat, learning lessons that no training hall could teach. When they faced each other on that morning outside Kyoto, Seijuro was outmatched before he drew his sword. The blow that ended the duel was characteristic of Musashi's approach. He did not engage in extended exchanges of technique, testing and probing as formal swordsmanship prescribed. Instead, he created an opening through psychological pressure and then struck with overwhelming speed and power. The fight was over in seconds, leaving Seichuro's carefully cultivated skills useless. The aftermath of this first Yoshioka duel sent shockwaves through the martial world of Kyoto. The head of one of the most prestigious schools in Japan had been defeated, his arm shattered by an unknown vagabond. Some questioned whether the duel had been conducted fairly, whether Musashi had used some form of trickery. But those who had witnessed the fight knew the truth. They had seen something unprecedented, a level of martial ability that transcended their understanding. Yoshioka Denshichiro's challenge came as no surprise. Family honor demanded that someone answer Musashi's insult, and as the next senior member of the school, the responsibility fell to him. Denshichiro was a different kind of fighter than his brother, more aggressive and less refined, but still bound by the assumptions of his training. His choice of the steel-reinforced staff as his weapon was an attempt to change the terms of the encounter. The staff had greater reach than a sword and could deliver crushing blows that armor might not stop. Denshichiro hoped that this unfamiliar weapon would disrupt Musashi's timing and give him the advantage he needed. But Musashi had faced staff fighters before, and he understood the weapon's strengths and weaknesses. The staff was powerful but relatively slow, and its length could become a liability in close quarters. When Denshichiro attacked, Musashi slipped inside the arc of his swing, closing to a distance where the staff became useless, and delivered a single lethal strike. The death of Denshichiro left the Yoshioka school in crisis. Their two best fighters had been defeated, one crippled and one killed, by the same opponent. The remaining members faced an impossible choice: accept their shame and allow Musashi to walk away victorious, or find some way to destroy him regardless of honor. Their decision to ambush Musashi at Ichijoji revealed how completely their values had collapsed. The samurai code they claimed to uphold demanded individual combat between warriors of honor. By bringing dozens of armed men to kill a single opponent, they abandoned any pretense of following that code. They had become what they would have once despised: assassins and murderers. Musashi's response to this threat demonstrated his strategic genius. He did not simply walk into the trap and fight his way out through superior skill, though he might have been capable of this. Instead, he arrived early, observed the enemy's dispositions, and developed a plan that would neutralize their numerical advantage. The key insight was that the ambushers expected him to approach from a particular direction. They had positioned themselves accordingly, creating a killing zone that would have been nearly impossible to escape. By circling around and attacking from an unexpected angle, Musashi turned their preparation against them. The careful positions they had taken became useless, and the confusion of the moment prevented them from coordinating their response. His decision to strike directly at young Matoshichiro was equally calculated. By killing the nominal head of the school first, he threw the remaining attackers into disarray. They had expected their young master to be protected by their numbers. His sudden death stunned them into momentary paralysis. That moment was all Musashi needed to begin his escape. The fight that followed was chaos. Musashi cut through opponents who got in his way, but he did not try to kill everyone. His goal was survival and escape, not total victory. He moved constantly, never allowing himself to be surrounded, using the terrain to limit the number of opponents who could attack him at once. By the time he reached safety, he had demonstrated a lesson that many warriors never learned. Sometimes the greatest victory is simply to survive. The destruction of the Yoshioka school marked the end of one phase of Musashi's life and the beginning of another. He had proven himself against the established martial institutions of Kyoto, defeating their best fighters and surviving their treachery. His reputation was now firmly established throughout Japan. But this victory, comprehensive as it was, left Musashi strangely unsatisfied. He had shown that he could defeat any opponent, but he had not yet found what he was truly seeking. The way of the sword, he was beginning to understand, was about more than winning fights. It was a path to something deeper, some fundamental truth about existence itself. This growing philosophical awareness would shape the rest of Musashi's journey. The battles still to come, including his legendary duel with Sasaki Kojiro, would be steps not just toward martial supremacy, but toward enlightenment. The Sword Saint was being born, though he himself did not yet fully understand what he was becoming. For now, he continued to wander, to fight, to learn. The roads of Japan stretched before him, full of danger and possibility. Somewhere out there, opponents waited who would test him in ways he could not yet imagine. And beyond all the duels and battles, beyond victory and defeat, lay the ultimate understanding that he sought, the void, the emptiness that contained everything, the final secret of the way. But those revelations, dear listener, lie in the chapters yet to come. For tonight, we leave Musashi at a crossroads, both literally and figuratively. Behind him lies a trail of defeated opponents and a reputation that will echo through centuries. Before him lies the unknown, the endless road of self-perfection that he has chosen to walk. He has learned much, but he knows that he has only begun. The greatest lessons are still ahead, and when they come, they will transform not just his understanding of combat, but his understanding of life itself. Let me share with you some of the wisdom that Musashi was beginning to formulate during these formative years, principles that would later be codified in his famous writings, but which were already taking shape in his mind. The first principle was what he called knowing the way broadly. Musashi believed that a warrior should not limit himself to the study of swordsmanship alone. He should understand many arts and sciences, from strategy to craftsmanship to the natural world. This broad knowledge provided perspective and insight that narrow specialization could never offer. A warrior who knew only the sword was like a man who could see with only one eye, missing the depth and dimension that true understanding required. The second principle was the importance of training the spirit as rigorously as the body. Many warriors focused exclusively on physical technique, drilling their cuts and parries until they became automatic. But Musashi understood that the body followed the mind, that a warrior whose spirit was weak or undisciplined would fail no matter how polished his technique might be. He trained himself to remain calm under pressure, to face death without flinching, to maintain clarity when chaos erupted around him. The third principle was the rejection of bias or preference in weapons, techniques, or approaches. Musashi saw that many warriors became attached to favorite moves or weapons, relying on them even when circumstances called for something different. This attachment was a form of limitation, a cage that the warrior had built for himself. True mastery meant being equally capable with any weapon, equally effective with any technique, adapting fluidly to whatever the situation demanded. The fourth principle was what Musashi called seeing what cannot be seen. This referred to the ability to perceive an opponent's intentions before they manifested in action, to read the subtle signs of posture, breath, and energy that betrayed what was to come. This skill could not be taught directly but had to be cultivated through years of experience and careful observation. It was perhaps the most important advantage a warrior could possess. The fifth principle was the acceptance of death. Musashi taught that a warrior who feared death was already defeated. Fear caused hesitation, and hesitation in combat was fatal. But this acceptance was not fatalism or recklessness. It was a clear-eyed recognition that death was always possible, and that the only appropriate response was to commit fully to each moment, holding nothing back, living as if each action might be one's last. These principles, still rough and unrefined, were already guiding Musashi's actions and decisions. They explained why he trained so broadly, why he remained unattached to any particular school or style, why he could face overwhelming odds without apparent fear. They were the foundation of the philosophy that would one day be expressed in the Book of Five Rings, though at this point in his life, Musashi had no thought of writing anything. The years following the Yoshioka vendetta saw Musashi continuing his wandering, but with a subtle shift in purpose. He was no longer merely seeking to test himself against strong opponents. He was beginning to search for a deeper understanding, a unifying principle that would make sense of all his experiences and observations. During this time, Musashi visited various temples and monasteries, seeking wisdom from priests and scholars. He studied the classics of Chinese military strategy, including the works attributed to Sun Tzu, finding parallels between battlefield tactics and individual combat. He practiced calligraphy and painting, discovering that the principles of the brush were surprisingly similar to the principles of the sword. He also began to attract students and followers, men who had heard of his legendary deeds and wished to learn from him. Musashi was a reluctant teacher at first, preferring his solitary wandering to the responsibilities of instruction. But he recognized that teaching could also be a form of learning, that explaining his methods forced him to understand them more clearly. His teaching style was unconventional, as one might expect. He did not simply demonstrate techniques and have students imitate them. Instead, he posed questions, created challenges, forced his students to discover principles for themselves. He believed that knowledge gained through one's own effort was far more valuable than knowledge simply handed down by a master. Musashi also had relationships during these years, though the historical record is frustratingly vague. There are suggestions that he had romantic attachments, that he may have fathered children, that he experienced the full range of human connections despite his solitary image. But he never married, never settled down, never allowed any attachment to interfere with his pursuit of the way. This was perhaps the most controversial aspect of Musashi's life and philosophy. He had written in his later years that he never regretted being without a wife or family, that he had followed the way of the warrior without compromise. Some have seen this as admirable dedication, others as a tragic failure to experience the fullness of human life. Musashi himself would likely have said that each person must find their own path, and that his path required sacrifices that might not be appropriate for others. The physical hardships of Musashi's wandering life were considerable. He slept outdoors in all seasons, often going hungry, exposed to illness and the dangers of the road. His body bore the marks of countless fights, scars that mapped the history of his violent journey. Yet he seemed to thrive on these difficulties, seeing them as necessary aspects of his training. He believed that comfort was the enemy of development, that a warrior who became soft and pampered would lose his edge. The hard conditions of his life kept him sharp, kept him aware, prevented him from falling into the complacency that destroyed so many talented fighters. Every day was a struggle for survival, and that struggle was the forge in which his spirit was tempered. As Musashi approached his late 20s, he began to hear reports of a swordsman whose fame rivaled his own. This man was called Sasaki Kojiro, and he was said to be the finest sword technician in Japan. Where Musashi was rough and unconventional, Kojiro was elegant and precise. Where Musashi relied on psychological warfare and strategic thinking, Kojiro trusted in pure, perfect technique. Kojiro's signature was a cut called the Tsubame Gaeshi, the swallow's tail cut. It was said that he could reverse the direction of his blade mid-stroke, like a swallow changing direction in flight, creating a technique that was nearly impossible to defend against. His sword was called the drying pole, a blade of unusual length that gave him a reach advantage over most opponents. The two men seemed destined to meet. They represented opposite approaches to the martial arts, and their confrontation would determine which philosophy was superior. Arrangements began to be made for a duel that would become the most famous in Japanese history, a clash of legends that would be discussed and debated for centuries to come. But that duel, dear listener, lies beyond the scope of tonight's narrative. We have followed Musashi from his difficult childhood through his brutal early victories, from his years of wandering to his destruction of the Yoshioka school. We have seen him develop from a wild, aggressive youth into a sophisticated strategist and philosopher of combat. The year was 1612, and Musashi was approximately 28 years old. Word had reached him of a swordsman named Sasaki Kojiro, a man whose reputation rivaled his own. Kojiro served the lord of a small domain in the western part of Japan, and he was considered by many to be the finest technician with a blade that the country had ever produced. A confrontation between these two legends seemed inevitable. Sasaki Kojiro was everything that Musashi was not. Where Musashi was rough, unkempt, and unconventional, Kojiro was elegant, refined, and classically trained. He had studied under the most prestigious masters and had developed his skills to a level of technical perfection that amazed all who witnessed it. His movements were said to be beautiful, almost artistic, each cut and parry executed with flawless precision. Kojiro's weapon was as distinctive as his style. He wielded an extraordinarily long sword called the Monohoshizao, which translates to the drying pole named for its resemblance to the bamboo poles used to hang laundry. This blade gave him a significant reach advantage over most opponents, allowing him to strike from distances where they could not retaliate. Combined with his speed and precision, this weapon made him virtually untouchable. His signature technique was the tsubame gaishi, the swallow counter or swallow tail cut. According to legend, Kojiro had developed this technique while watching swallows in flight, observing how they could reverse direction instantaneously. He learned to replicate this movement with his blade, delivering a downward cut and then reversing into an upward stroke so quickly that the two movements seemed to be one. No one had ever survived this technique. The contrast between the two swordsmen extended beyond their fighting styles to their very philosophies of combat. Kojiro believed in the perfection of technique, the idea that victory came through flawless execution of precisely practiced movements. He trusted his training completely, confident that his superior skill would overcome any opponent. His was the way of the artist, seeking beauty and precision in every action. Musashi, by contrast, had come to believe that technique alone was never enough. He had seen too many skilled fighters fall because they could not adapt to unexpected circumstances. His approach emphasized strategy, psychology, and the willingness to do whatever was necessary to win. Where Kojiro sought perfection, Musashi sought effectiveness. Where Kojiro trained in dojos, Musashi had learned in the chaos of real combat. The duel was arranged through official channels, with the blessing of the local lord who served as Kojiro's patron. The location chosen was a small island called Funajima, later renamed Ganryujima in honor of Kojiro's fighting name, Ganryu. The island lay in the strait between the main islands of Honshu and Kyushu, accessible only by boat. It was a remote, neutral ground where the two greatest swordsmen of the age would settle their rivalry once and for all. In the days before the duel, Musashi engaged in his characteristic psychological warfare. He sent no word of his preparations, made no appearances, gave no indication of how he intended to fight. Kojiro and his supporters waited in growing uncertainty, unable to predict what this strange, unconventional warrior might do. The waiting itself became a weapon, eroding their confidence with each passing hour. The night before the duel, Musashi stayed at the home of a local merchant rather than at a formal lodging where he might be observed. He spent the evening in apparent calm, eating a simple meal and retiring early. But his mind was far from idle. He was analyzing everything he knew about Kojiro, searching for weaknesses, formulating his strategy for the encounter to come. One detail that Musashi had learned proved crucial. Kojiro was known for his pride, his absolute confidence in his own abilities. He had never lost a duel, and this unbroken string of victories had bred in him a certainty that bordered on arrogance. He expected to win not because he had prepared for every possibility, but because he simply could not imagine losing. This pride, Musashi recognized, could be exploited. The morning of the duel arrived, and Kojiro made his way to the island at the appointed hour. He was dressed magnificently, his clothing and armor reflecting his status as a respected retainer of a noble lord. His famous long sword hung at his side, its blade freshly polished and razor-sharp. He stood on the beach with his seconds and waited for his opponent to arrive. The appointed hour came and went. Musashi did not appear. The sun rose higher in the sky, and still there was no sign of him. Kojiro waited with growing impatience, pacing the beach, his famous composure beginning to crack. Where was this so-called sword saint? Was he a coward after all? Had his reputation been nothing but exaggeration and myth? What Kojiro did not know was that Musashi had deliberately overslept or pretended to. He had risen late, taken his time with breakfast, and boarded his boat for the island long after he should have departed. During the crossing, he engaged in one final act of preparation. Taking a spare oar from the boat, he began to carve it into a rough wooden sword, longer than his usual weapons, designed specifically for this encounter. The boat carrying Musashi finally approached the island, hours late. Kojiro stood on the beach, his anger barely contained, watching the vessel draw near. When Musashi leaped from the boat before it had even properly landed, splashing through the shallow water with his crude wooden sword raised, Kojiro's composure finally shattered. He drew his magnificent blade and charged forward, so enraged that he threw his scabbard into the sea. As the scabbard flew through the air, Musashi called out a taunt that has echoed through history. "You have already lost," he said. "A warrior who throws away his scabbard does not expect to return his sword to it. He has already accepted defeat in his heart." The words were calculated to penetrate Kojiro's anger and plant a seed of doubt at the critical moment. The two warriors closed the distance between them in seconds. Kojiro launched his famous Tsubame Geishi, the swallow cut that had never failed him. The long blade swept down toward Musashi's skull, then reversed in that lightning-quick motion that had killed so many before. It was perfect, beautiful, exactly as Kojiro had performed it 1,000 times in practice. But Musashi was no longer where the blade expected to find him. In the instant before impact, he had shifted his position, moving not backward as most opponents did, but forward and to the side. The tip of Kojiro's sword sliced through the cloth band holding back Musashi's hair, missing his skull by a fraction of an inch. Before Kojiro could recover, Musashi's wooden oar came crashing down. The blow struck Kojiro's skull with tremendous force. The elegant swordsman crumpled to the sand, his legendary blade falling from nerveless fingers. He was not yet dead, but the fight was over. Musashi stood over his fallen opponent for a moment, confirming that the threat was ended, then turned and walked back toward his waiting boat without a backward glance. Some accounts say that Musashi delivered a finishing blow, while others suggest that Kojiro died from the initial strike. What is certain is that the duel lasted only seconds, that the greatest technical swordsman in Japan had been defeated by a man wielding a wooden oar carved during a boat ride. The implications of this victory would resonate through the martial arts world for centuries. Musashi had won not through superior technique, but through superior strategy. He had arrived late to unsettle his opponent's mind. He had used a weapon of unusual length to negate Kojiro's reach advantage. He had positioned himself so that the rising sun was in Kojiro's eyes. He had taunted his enemy at the critical moment to disrupt his concentration. Every element of the encounter had been calculated and controlled. The victory at Ganryujima marked a turning point in Musashi's life. He was now unquestionably the greatest swordsman in Japan, with a record of over 60 duels and not a single defeat. His fame had reached its peak, and his place in history was secured. But rather than celebrating this achievement, Musashi entered a period of deep reflection and questioning. The aftermath of the duel was complicated by political considerations. Kojiro had been a retainer of a powerful lord, and his death created an awkward situation. While the duel had been conducted according to proper forms, with official sanction, there were those who resented Musashi's victory and sought to avenge Kojiro. Musashi was forced to leave the area quickly, departing by boat even as Kojiro's supporters gathered on the shore. For several years after Ganryujima, Musashi maintained a low profile, avoiding the major cities and the attention of powerful lords. He wandered through rural areas, teaching small groups of students and continuing his personal practice. The constant danger of his earlier years had diminished, but it had not disappeared entirely. There were always those who wished to test themselves against the legendary sword saint, and some who dreamed of being the one to finally defeat him. During this period of wandering, Musashi encountered a young man who would become one of his most devoted students. This was Tarao Magonoho, who first met Musashi in circumstances that are not clearly recorded, but who would remain with the master for decades. Magonoho would eventually become the primary inheritor of Musashi's style, responsible for preserving and transmitting the teachings of the Nitin Ichiryu to future generations. The relationship between Musashi and his students was unlike that of most martial arts teachers of the era. He did not establish a formal school with ranks and certificates, did not charge fees for instruction, did not create the elaborate hierarchies that characterized other traditions. Instead, he taught those who sought him out, sharing his insights freely with anyone who demonstrated genuine dedication to the way. His teaching methods could be harsh and unconventional. He might set a student an impossible task and then observe how they approached it. He might answer a question with another question, forcing the student to find the answer within themselves. He might demonstrate a technique once and then never show it again, expecting the student to grasp its essence from that single exposure. These methods frustrated many who came to him expecting systematic instruction. But those who persevered found that Musashi's teaching, however difficult, led to genuine understanding. By forcing students to discover principles for themselves, he ensured that their knowledge was deep and personal, not merely intellectual. They did not simply learn techniques, they developed the capacity to create techniques appropriate to any situation. They became not imitators of Musashi, but independent masters in their own right. Musashi's philosophical development during these years was influenced by his study of various traditions. He read the Chinese classics of strategy and philosophy, finding in them principles that resonated with his own experience. He studied Buddhism, particularly Zen, absorbing its emphasis on direct experience and its distrust of intellectual elaboration. He examined Confucianism, Taoism, and other schools of thought, taking from each what seemed true and useful. But he was no mere eclectic, combining elements from different traditions without discrimination. He subjected everything he learned to the test of practical experience. If a principle worked in the actual circumstances of life and combat, he accepted it. If it remained merely theoretical, however elegant it might seem, he discarded it. This relentless practicality was the hallmark of his approach to all learning. One principle that emerged from his studies and experience was the importance of what he called the twofold gaze. This referred to the ability to see both the particular and the general simultaneously, to focus on immediate details while maintaining awareness of the broader context. In combat, this meant watching the opponent's weapon while also perceiving their entire body, their breathing, their psychological state. In life, it meant attending to specific tasks while never losing sight of larger purposes. Another crucial principle was the concept of crossing at a ford. Musashi used this metaphor to describe moments of critical transition, points where circumstances changed fundamentally and new approaches became necessary. Just as a traveler crossing a river had to recognize when they had reached the other side and adjust their behavior accordingly, a warrior or any person facing challenges had to recognize when situations had fundamentally changed and respond appropriately. Musashi also developed his understanding of rhythm during these years. He observed that all activities, from the movements of combat to the patterns of daily life, had their own rhythms. Most people fell into habitual rhythms unconsciously, becoming predictable and therefore vulnerable. The master was one who could perceive the rhythms of situations and opponents, who could disrupt unfavorable rhythms and impose favorable ones, who could change tempo unexpectedly to create decisive advantages. He was approximately 30 years old, and he had spent nearly 2 decades in constant pursuit of martial excellence. He had killed many men, defeated many more, and accumulated a body of practical knowledge about combat that no one could match. But as he contemplated his victory over Kojiro, he realized that something was still missing. He had achieved mastery over opponents, but he had not yet achieved mastery over himself. The years following Ganryujima saw Musashi begin a gradual transformation. He continued to practice his martial arts with undiminished intensity, but his focus began to shift from defeating external enemies to understanding deeper principles. He started to see the way of the sword not as an end in itself, but as a path to broader wisdom, a discipline through which one could understand the nature of all things. During this period, Musashi began to explore other arts with the same dedication he had brought to swordsmanship. He studied painting under masters of the ink brush tradition, eventually developing a style that was spare, powerful, and deeply evocative. His paintings of birds, particularly cormorants and shrikes, would be recognized as masterworks, prized by collectors and displayed in temples and noble households. He also practiced calligraphy, the art of beautiful writing that was considered essential to any educated person in East Asia. His brushwork in this medium showed the same qualities as his painting: bold strokes executed with perfect control, an economy of expression that suggested far more than it explicitly showed. Each character he wrote reflected the principles of timing, balance, and decisive action that governed his swordsmanship. The connection between martial arts and brush arts was not merely metaphorical for Musashi. He perceived that the same mental state, the same quality of attention and intention, was required for excellence in both fields. When he painted or wrote, he entered the same condition of alert readiness that he cultivated for combat. The brush became a weapon, the paper a battlefield, and the creation of art a form of combat with the resistant materials and one's own limitations. This insight extended to his understanding of the creative process itself. Musashi observed that great works of art, like great victories in combat, could not be achieved through mere technical facility. They required a kind of emptiness, a freedom from preconception that allowed appropriate action to arise spontaneously. The artist who was too attached to particular outcomes or methods could never achieve true excellence. Only by letting go could one grasp the infinite. His paintings of birds became particularly famous. He depicted cormorants, shrikes, herons, and other species with a vitality and immediacy that seemed to capture the very essence of their being. These were not detailed, realistic renderings, but spare, suggestive images that conveyed movement, energy, and life through the simplest possible means. Critics have noted that these bird paintings seem to embody the same striking directness that characterized Musashi's approach to combat. The shrike was a particularly meaningful subject for Musashi. This small predatory bird, known for impaling its prey on thorns, represented a kind of fierce efficiency that resonated with the warrior's sensibility. Musashi's shrike paintings show the bird in moments of intense alertness, poised for action, embodying the state of readiness that he cultivated throughout his life. These images became treasured possessions, passed down through generations of collectors. Sculpture became another outlet for Musashi's artistic impulses. He carved wooden figures with remarkable skill, creating images of Buddhist deities and other subjects that demonstrated both technical mastery and spiritual depth. These carvings, like his paintings and calligraphy, were expressions of the same fundamental understanding that guided his martial practice. The chisel in his hand moved with the same decisive authority as his sword. Among his sculptural works were images of Fudo, the fierce Buddhist deity who represents the destruction of delusion and the obstacles to enlightenment. This deity, depicted surrounded by flames and wielding a sword, had obvious significance for a warrior seeking spiritual understanding through martial practice. Musashi's carvings of Fudo show both the wrathful aspect of the deity and an underlying compassion, suggesting that the warrior's violence served ultimately benevolent purposes. Musashi came to believe that all these arts, from sword fighting to brush painting to wood carving, were manifestations of a single underlying principle. The person who truly understood this principle could apply it to any field of endeavor. The way was not many ways but one way, appearing in different forms but always governed by the same essential truths. This realization was perhaps his most important insight, transcending the particular skills he had mastered to touch something universal. This insight would become central to his later teachings. He taught his students that they should not merely learn techniques, but should seek to understand the principles behind those techniques. A movement that worked in swordsmanship might be applied to negotiation, to leadership, to any situation requiring decisive action. The master was not someone who knew many tricks, but someone who understood fundamental truth. Around the year 1615, Musashi found himself involved in another major military conflict. The Tokugawa shogunate, now firmly established as the rulers of Japan, moved to eliminate the last major threat to their power, the supporters of the Toyotomi clan who had gathered at Osaka Castle. This siege, which would end with the complete destruction of the Toyotomi and the death of thousands, drew warriors from across the country. Musashi's role in the siege of Osaka is not entirely clear from historical records. Some accounts suggest he fought on the Tokugawa side, perhaps seeking to establish himself with the new government after having fought against them at Sekigahara. Others suggest he may have served as an advisor or observer rather than a direct combatant. What is certain is that he witnessed the carnage and chaos of this final great battle of the samurai era. The siege was conducted in two campaigns, known as the Winter Campaign and the Summer Campaign. The Winter Campaign ended in a negotiated truce that proved temporary, while the Summer Campaign culminated in the complete destruction of Osaka Castle and the death of Toyotomi Hideyori, the young lord whose cause the defenders had championed. Tens of thousands died in the fighting, and the city itself was largely destroyed by fire. Musashi observed the tactics employed on both sides, noting how the principles of individual combat scaled up to mass warfare. He saw how psychological factors, the morale of troops, the confidence of commanders, the perception of momentum, often determined outcomes more than raw numbers or positions. He watched as carefully planned strategies fell apart in the chaos of actual combat, and as improvised responses sometimes saved situations that seemed hopeless. The siege reinforced lessons that Musashi had first learned at Sekigahara. Individual skill mattered little when armies clashed. Strategy, logistics, and the ability to coordinate large forces determined victory far more than any single warrior's prowess. But Musashi also observed that the principles governing large-scale combat were not fundamentally different from those governing individual duels. Scale changed, but the essential nature of conflict remained the same. He noted particularly the importance of what he would later call the attack of no attack, the strategy of creating situations where the enemy defeated themselves. The Tokugawa forces had employed this principle masterfully, using diplomacy and deception to isolate the Osaka defenders, cutting off their supplies and undermining their alliances until the castle's fall became inevitable. Superior warriors had been defeated not by superior fighting, but by superior strategy. In the decades following Osaka, Japan entered an era of peace that would last for more than 2 centuries. The constant warfare that had defined the Sengoku period gave way to stable governance under the Tokugawa shogunate. Samurai who had been warriors became administrators and bureaucrats. The skills of combat, while still practiced and honored, became increasingly ceremonial and theoretical. This transformation posed a profound challenge for the martial arts community. How could one maintain genuine combat effectiveness in an era without combat? Many schools became increasingly stylized, their techniques elaborated and refined, but increasingly disconnected from the reality of violence. Forms became more important than function, appearance more valued than effectiveness. The martial arts risked becoming mere performance. Musashi was deeply concerned by this trend. He believed that martial training which lost touch with the reality of combat was worse than useless. It was actively dangerous, giving practitioners false confidence that would fail them if they ever faced genuine violence. He insisted that his students train with the same intensity and seriousness that they would bring to actual battle, maintaining the warrior's mindset even in times of peace. At the same time, Musashi recognized that the end of warfare created opportunities for deeper development. The constant demands of survival and combat had left little time for reflection during his early years. Now, in the relative peace of the new era, he could examine his experiences more carefully, extracting principles and understanding that had been implicit in his actions but never fully articulated. Musashi adapted to this new reality while remaining true to his principles. He never accepted permanent employment with any lord, preferring to maintain his independence and continue his personal development. He wandered less than in his youth, but never truly settled, always searching for new challenges and new understandings. He taught students when they sought him out, but never established a formal school with fixed curricula and rigid hierarchies. His approach to teaching reflected his broader philosophy. He believed that each student must find their own way, that rigid adherence to predetermined methods would produce technicians rather than masters. He presented principles rather than techniques, asking questions rather than providing answers, forcing his students to discover truth through their own effort and experience. Many of the stories about Musashi from this period emphasize his unconventional nature and his disregard for social conventions. He reportedly arrived at formal occasions in inappropriate dress, refused to bow to powerful lords, and generally behaved as if the normal rules of society did not apply to him. Whether these stories are accurate or exaggerated, they reflect a consistent image: a man who lived entirely according to his own understanding, regardless of external expectations. His personal life remained austere and largely solitary. He never married, never established a household, never accumulated wealth or property beyond what was necessary for survival. He lived simply, ate simply, and devoted himself entirely to the pursuit of his art. This single-minded dedication was both his greatest strength and perhaps his greatest limitation. As Musashi entered his 50s and then his 60s, his health began to decline. The decades of hard living, the countless injuries accumulated in battle, the simple wear of age took their toll on his body, but his mind remained sharp, and his understanding continued to deepen. He began to feel an urgency to transmit what he had learned before his time ran out. Around 1640, Musashi accepted an invitation from the Lord of Kumamoto domain to settle in that territory. For the first time in his life, he had something resembling a permanent home. He was given lodging and a modest stipend, allowed to teach and practice as he wished. It was here, in the relative peace of his final years, that he would complete his greatest written work. In 1643, Musashi retired to a cave called Raigando, the Spirit Rock Cave, located in the mountains near Kumamoto. Here, in isolation and meditation, he began to write the text that would preserve his wisdom for future generations. He called it the Gorin no Sho, the Book of Five Rings, though this title was probably added later by his disciples. The choice of the cave as his final retreat was deliberate and symbolic. Throughout his life, Musashi had sought to strip away everything unnecessary, to reduce his existence to its essential elements. The cave represented the ultimate simplification, a return to the most basic conditions of human existence. Here, freed from all distractions, he could focus entirely on the task of transmitting his understanding. The writing process was itself a form of meditation and refinement. Musashi did not simply record what he knew, he clarified and deepened his understanding through the act of expression. Each sentence was carefully considered, each word chosen for maximum precision and impact. The resulting text, though relatively brief, contained a lifetime of accumulated wisdom distilled to its purest form. The book was structured around the five classical elements of Japanese Buddhist cosmology: earth, water, fire, wind, and void. Each section used its element as a metaphor for different aspects of martial strategy, and by extension, the strategy of life itself. The writing was spare and direct, avoiding the flowery language common in Japanese literature of the period, reflecting Musashi's personality and his belief that truth should be expressed simply. The Earth chapter laid out the foundations of Musashi's way, explaining the basic principles that underlay all the rest. He emphasized the importance of broad knowledge, of understanding many arts and sciences rather than specializing narrowly. He described the proper mindset for a warrior and the importance of constant, dedicated practice. This chapter established the framework for everything that followed. He wrote of the importance of knowing the way broadly, of studying not just swordsmanship, but all arts and crafts, all aspects of life. The warrior who knew only fighting was limited, unable to perceive the connections between combat and other endeavors, unable to apply insights from one domain to another. True mastery required comprehensive understanding. The water chapter dealt with the specifics of combat technique, describing stances, cuts, and tactical principles in practical detail. Water was chosen as the metaphor because of its adaptability, its ability to take any shape while maintaining its essential nature. Musashi taught that a warrior should be like water, responding fluidly to whatever situation arose rather than rigidly adhering to predetermined forms. In this chapter, Musashi described his two-sword style in detail, explaining the rationale for wielding both blades simultaneously and the specific techniques he had developed. He discussed the importance of proper posture and breathing, the use of the gaze, and the maintenance of mental equilibrium. These were practical instructions, meant to be practiced and applied, not merely read and understood intellectually. The fire chapter addressed the dynamics of combat, the rhythm and timing that determine victory or defeat. Fire represented intensity and explosiveness, the ability to overwhelm an opponent through aggressive action. But Musashi also emphasized control, the importance of knowing when to attack and when to wait. Uncontrolled aggression was as dangerous as passivity. He described various tactical situations and how to handle them, from fighting single opponents to facing multiple enemies, from combat in confined spaces to battles in open terrain. He discussed how to read an opponent's intentions, how to create openings, how to exploit psychological weaknesses. These teachings were applicable far beyond the dueling ground, relevant to any competitive or conflictual situation. The Wind chapter examined the teachings of other martial schools, pointing out their strengths and weaknesses. Musashi criticized approaches that he considered limited or artificial, while acknowledging that other traditions had valuable insights to offer. This chapter demonstrated his comprehensive knowledge of the martial arts landscape and his willingness to learn from any source. He was particularly critical of schools that emphasized either speed or strength to the exclusion of other factors, that relied on secret techniques or special weapons, that focused on appearance rather than effectiveness. True mastery, he argued, could not depend on any single factor or advantage. The complete warrior was prepared for any circumstance, limited by nothing. The Void chapter was the shortest and most mysterious, dealing with the ultimate spiritual dimensions of the martial way. The Void was emptiness, but not the emptiness of nothingness. It was the emptiness that contained all possibilities, the state of perfect readiness from which appropriate action arose spontaneously. This was the highest teaching, accessible only to those who had mastered everything that came before. Musashi wrote that the void was the state where there was nothing, yet from this nothing, everything could arise. It was the condition of the mind when all thoughts, fears, and preconceptions had been released, when the warrior became a pure instrument of appropriate action. Achieving this state was the ultimate goal of martial training, and indeed of all spiritual practice. Musashi completed the Book of 5 Rings just weeks before his death, passing it to his most trusted student with instructions for its preservation and transmission. He also wrote a shorter text called the Dokodo, the Way of Walking Alone, which consisted of 21 precepts summarizing his philosophy of life. These precepts were stark and uncompromising, reflecting a lifetime of solitary dedication to the warrior's path. Among the precepts of the Dokodo were such statements as, "Do not let yourself be guided by the feeling of lust or love. Do not seek pleasure for its own sake. Never be jealous. Do not regret what you have done. Never let yourself be saddened by a separation. Do not fear death." These were not rules for ordinary people, but the distilled wisdom of a man who had walked an extraordinary path. Other precepts addressed practical matters with the same uncompromising directness. Respect Buddha and the gods without counting on their help. You may abandon your own body, but you must preserve your honor. Never stray from the way of the martial arts. These statements reveal a man who had achieved remarkable self-sufficiency, who relied on nothing external for his sense of purpose or value. The Dokodo also contained precepts that revealed Musashi's aesthetic sensibility alongside his warrior nature. Do not collect weapons or practice with weapons beyond what is useful. Do not have preferences among material things. Be indifferent to where you live. These statements reflect his rejection of attachment and accumulation, his belief that true freedom came from needing nothing. Perhaps most poignantly, the final precepts address the ultimate concerns of human existence. Have no heart for approaching the path of love. Have no attachment to your dwelling. Never fear death. These were the words of a man facing his own mortality with the same clear-eyed courage he had brought to every duel. He met death as he had met every opponent, without flinching, without regret. In the final weeks of his life, Musashi gave away his few possessions, said farewell to his students and the few friends he had made, and prepared himself for the end. He maintained his practice to the last, performing his exercises and meditations despite his failing body. He faced death as the final opponent, one that could not be defeated but could be met with dignity. On the 19th day of the 5th month in the year 1645, Miyamoto Musashi died in his cave retreat at Reigondo. He was approximately 61 years old. According to his wishes, he was buried in his armor, facing the road that led to Edo, the seat of the Tokugawa shogunate. Even in death, the sword saint remained vigilant, watching over the land he had done so much to shape. The news of his death spread slowly across Japan, carried by travelers and students to the distant corners of the country. Many refused to believe it at first. So closely had Musashi become identified with invincibility. But gradually the truth was accepted, and the process of transforming the man into legend began. Stories of his exploits, already embellished during his lifetime, grew even more fantastic in the retelling. His students scattered across Japan, teaching their own students and establishing lineages that would preserve his methods for centuries. The Niiten Ichiryu, the school of two heavens as one, continued to be practiced by dedicated practitioners who saw themselves as carrying forward Musashi's legacy. Though the style never became widespread like some other schools, It maintained its integrity and its connection to its founder's principles. The Book of Five Rings was initially transmitted only to trusted students, considered too valuable and dangerous to share widely. But over time, as Japan's long peace continued and the practical urgency of martial training diminished, the text became more widely available. By the 19th century, it had achieved the status of a classic, studied not just by martial artists, but by anyone interested in strategy and personal development. The legacy of Miyamoto Musashi extends far beyond the martial arts. His writings have been studied by business leaders, military strategists, and athletes, seeking to understand the principles of competition and excellence. The Book of Five Rings has been translated into dozens of languages and remains in print nearly 4 centuries after it was written. His paintings and calligraphy are treasured as masterworks of Japanese art. In Japan, Musashi became a cultural icon, the subject of novels, plays, films, and television series. The most famous of these was Yoshikawa Eiji's epic novel Musashi, published in serialized form during the 1930s and 40s. This novel, which took considerable creative liberties with the historical record, shaped the popular image of Musashi more than any other source. It presented him as a spiritual seeker as much as a warrior, emphasizing his journey toward enlightenment. Musashi's influence on subsequent martial arts development was profound. His emphasis on principle over technique, on adaptability over rigid adherence to forms, anticipated many developments in modern martial arts. The mixed martial arts movement of the late 20th and early 21st centuries echoed many of his ideas, particularly the rejection of stylistic limitations and the emphasis on practical effectiveness. His artistic legacy, while less famous than his martial achievements, has been increasingly recognized by scholars and collectors. His paintings, particularly those spare ink wash works depicting birds and natural subjects, are considered masterpieces of their genre. They demonstrate that the warrior spirit he cultivated could express itself in creation as well as destruction, in beauty as well as violence. But Musashi's greatest legacy may be the example of his life itself. He demonstrated that the pursuit of excellence in any field requires total dedication, the willingness to sacrifice comfort and convention for the sake of mastery. He showed that true understanding transcends any particular discipline, that principles learned in one domain can illuminate all others. He proved that an individual of sufficient determination can overcome any obstacle, defeat any opponent, achieve any goal. His path was not one that most people could or should follow. The sacrifices he made, the solitary life he led, the violence that filled his years were extreme even by the standards of his violent age. But the principles he discovered through this extreme path have universal application. We need not fight duels to learn from Musashi. We need only commit ourselves fully to our chosen endeavors, remain adaptable in the face of change, and never stop seeking deeper understanding. What can the modern person take from Musashi's example? First, the importance of total commitment. Musashi did not dabble in martial arts. He devoted his entire being to the pursuit of mastery. Whatever field we choose to pursue, we achieve excellence only through similar dedication. Partial effort yields partial results. True mastery demands everything we have to give. Second, the value of practical experience over theoretical knowledge. Musashi learned primarily through doing, through testing himself in real combat situations where failure meant death. While few modern pursuits carry such stakes, the principle remains valid. Book learning and formal instruction have their place, but they cannot substitute for the lessons that come from actual practice, actual failure, actual adaptation. Third, the necessity of constant adaptation and growth. Musashi never stopped developing, never assumed he had learned all there was to know. Even in his 60s, weakened by age and illness, he was still refining his understanding, still discovering new depths in principles he had practiced for decades. The moment we stop growing is the moment we begin to decline. Fourth, the importance of seeing connections between different fields. Musashi's greatest insight was that all arts are one, that principles discovered in combat could illuminate painting, that lessons learned from nature could be applied to strategy. In our increasingly specialized world, this integrative vision is more valuable than ever. The person who can see patterns across domains has a tremendous advantage over those trapped in narrow expertise. Fifth, The power of psychological factors. Musashi understood that most conflicts are decided in the mind before any physical action occurs. He cultivated unshakable calm and learned to disturb his opponent's mental equilibrium. In any competitive endeavor, those who master their own minds and understand the minds of others hold a decisive advantage. Sixth, the value of simplicity and the rejection of unnecessary complication. Musashi lived with extreme simplicity, refusing to accumulate possessions or attachments that might distract from his purpose. His writing and painting reflected this same aesthetic, achieving maximum effect through minimum means. In an age of overwhelming complexity and constant distraction, this commitment to essentials is profoundly liberating. Finally, the acceptance of mortality as a source of clarity and motivation. Musashi's constant awareness of death freed him from the hesitation and timidity that plague most people. He understood that our time is limited and that this limitation gives meaning to our choices. By accepting death, we embrace life more fully. The Sword Saint's journey began in a small mountain village with a wild boy teaching himself to fight against the trees. It ended in a cave with an old man writing down the wisdom of a lifetime. Between those points lay a path of blood and beauty, of violence and art, of relentless struggle and ultimate peace. It was a uniquely Japanese story, yet it speaks to something universal in human experience. The cherry blossoms fall as they have fallen every spring for centuries since Musashi walked the earth. The temples he visited still stand, the mountains he climbed still rise against the sky. In Kumamoto, visitors still climb to Raigando Cave, still stand where the Sword Saint spent his final days. The place retains a quality of stillness and depth, as if something of his presence remains there, waiting for those who come seeking wisdom. Musashi understood that life itself is a kind of combat, a constant struggle against external challenges and internal weaknesses. The warrior who masters this combat finds not just victory but wisdom, not just survival but meaning. The way of the sword, properly understood, is the way of life itself. This is the final teaching of the Sword Saint, the gift he left to all who follow. As you go about your own life, dear listener, perhaps you might carry some of Musashi's wisdom with you. When you face challenges, remember his strategic thinking, his refusal to be bound by convention, his willingness to adapt and overcome. When you pursue your goals, remember his total dedication, his acceptance of hardship as the price of excellence. When you seek understanding, remember that all arts are one, that truth appears in many forms but is always the same truth. Consider the moments in your own life that call for the warrior's spirit. Not physical combat, perhaps, but the struggles we all face, the difficult conversation that must be had, the project that seems impossible, the fear that holds us back from pursuing our dreams. In these moments, channel something of Musashi's courage and clarity. Meet your challenges directly, without hesitation, without excuses, with full commitment to the outcome you seek. Remember, too, his emphasis on preparation. Musashi arrived early to his duels, studied the terrain, understood his opponents before the first blow was struck. In whatever arena you compete, thorough preparation provides the foundation for success. The warrior who enters combat without preparation relies on luck, and luck is a fickle ally. Think about his rejection of rigidity and his embrace of adaptability. The world is constantly changing, constantly presenting new challenges that cannot be met with old solutions. Like water, we must flow around obstacles, take the shape of our containers, find our way through any terrain. Those who cling to fixed approaches will eventually encounter situations their methods cannot address. Reflect on his integration of opposites. The warrior who was also an artist, the killer who created beauty, the man of violence who sought and found peace. These apparent contradictions resolved themselves in a life lived with complete integrity, where every action expressed the same fundamental understanding. Perhaps in your own life, aspects that seem to conflict can be integrated into a larger wholeness. The Nocturnal Chronicler has guided you through the shadows of history, through the life of a man who transcended his violent age to achieve a kind of immortality. Miyamoto Musashi lived, fought, created, and died, but his spirit lives on in everyone who seeks to master themselves and their circumstances, who refuses to accept mediocrity, who understands that the way has no end. In Regondo Cave, the walls still bear the marks of centuries. Pilgrims still come, drawn by something they cannot quite name, seeking a connection to the sword saint who once sat in that darkness and contemplated the void. What they find there depends on what they bring: questions, hopes, fears, aspirations. The cave offers no answers, only silence and space for reflection. Perhaps that is the final lesson. Musashi could not give us enlightenment. He could only show us that enlightenment was possible and describe the path he had walked to find it. Each of us must make our own journey, face our own opponents, discover our own understanding. The way that can be followed by simply copying another is not the true way. We must walk it ourselves, step by step, blow by blow, until we arrive at our own understanding. The sword saint has sheathed his blade at last.